When you think about it, history isn't just a list of dates and events. It's more like a series of dominoes. One thing happens, which leads to a solution, but then that solution just knocks over the next domino, creating an even bigger problem. That's exactly what we're going to trace today. We're going to follow this incredible chain reaction, all the way from a single gunshot back in 1914, through two world wars, and right into the Cold War standoff that basically defined the entire century.
So, where does this all kick off? Well, it starts with one bullet, just one, an assassination that ends up setting the whole world on fire. This is that first domino, the initial link in this long chain of problems and, not so great solutions that are going to drag the world down a path of conflict that nobody could have imagined. All right, so first up, the Great War. I mean, you can't overstate this. This is the war that absolutely broke the old world. It didn't just redraw a few borders. It completely shattered the way Europe had worked for 100 years. And yeah, it really set the stage for everything, and I mean everything, that followed. And when you look at the timeline, it is just, wow. It's staggering how fast it all went down. We're talking about a local crisis in the Balkans exploding into a massive continent-wide war in what? A little over a month? It's all because of this tangled web of alliances. See, they were supposed to keep the peace, right? A balance of power. But instead, they acted like a giant tripwire. One country gets pulled in, and suddenly, bam, 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 everyone is tumbling into the fight. So when the fighting finally stopped, it wasn't like things just went back to normal. Oh, no. This was a complete and total collapse of the old world. Think about it. Empires that had been around for centuries, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, they were just gone, wiped off the map. This was the first total war, and it left Europe an absolute wreck. So the biggest question on everyone's mind was, okay, now what? How in the world do you build a lasting peace on top of all this devastation? Okay, so here comes the first solution. The big idea was the post-war settlement. You've got the famous Treaty of Versailles and this brand new thing called the League of Nations. And look, it was a really ambitious plan, maybe a little too idealistic, but the goal was noble. Build a peace that would last and make sure a war like that could never, ever happen again. And at the heart of this whole thing was this really radical idea called collective security. The principle was actually pretty simple. If you attack one of us, you've attacked all of us, and we're all going to come down on you. It's a great idea, right? Super hopeful. But, and this is a big but, it's the perfect example of how a beautiful idea can just completely fall apart when it hits the messy reality of politics. And yeah, the foundation for this new peace was, let's just say, super shaky. Right from the get-go, it was just riddled with problems. You had countries like Italy feeling cheated. You had these brand new nations that were totally unstable. And here's the kicker. Two of the world's biggest players, the USA and the new Soviet Union, weren't even part of the club. And then there was Germany, just simmering with resentment over the treaty. It was a recipe for disaster, really. But you know what? For a little while there, in the mid-20s, it actually looked like it might work. This time was called the Locarno spirit. Diplomacy was happening, treaties were being signed, Germany was even brought back into the fold. It really felt like, okay, maybe we did it. Maybe this is going to stick. It was this tiny, fragile glimmer of hope. But it was about to get hit by a wrecking ball. And that wrecking ball was the stock market crash. The Great Depression just completely shattered all that fragile optimism. Suddenly you have economic collapse, which means mass unemployment, desperation, and that's the perfect breeding ground for radical extremist ideas and, frankly, for aggressive leaders to rise up. The fallout was, well, it was immediate and it was catastrophic. The chaos in Germany, it literally paved the road for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Over in Asia, Japan just goes and invades Manchuria, and the League of Nations, it proves to be completely powerless. It could do nothing. So that grand experiment, that big solution to World War I, had officially failed. And in its failure, it created our next big problem, one that was arguably way more dangerous, the rise of these aggressive expansionist dictatorships. So, with collective security in tatters, the world starts this long, slow, unavoidable slide into another massive war. And the way the world decided to deal with it this time was dominated by this new, and I have to say, deeply controversial policy. And that policy was appeasement. You have to put yourself in their shoes. These leaders were absolutely haunted by the memories of the Great War, the sheer slaughter of it all. So they faced this impossible question. How do you deal with a guy like Hitler without kicking off another world war? Their answer was to give him concessions, basically, to give in to some of his demands, hoping it would satisfy him and keep the peace. But to really get a grip on the 1930s, we have to dig into the debate that raged around this idea. And this is really the core question of the 1930s, and honestly, historians still argue about it. Was appeasement a smart, pragmatic choice made by people desperate to avoid another horrific war? Or was it a catastrophic mistake, a total misreading of Hitler that just encouraged him, just fed the beast, and made a bigger war guaranteed? And as you look at the steps, you can see how it played out. Each move Hitler made was met with, well, not much. He remilitarizes the Rhineland. Nothing. He annexes Austria. Nothing. He takes a piece of Czechoslovakia, then all of it. Every time the world gave in, he didn't see it as a move for peace. He saw it as weakness. It just convinced him he could get away with more. So when he finally invaded Poland, it wasn't a shock. It was the predictable, inevitable final straw. So World War II ends in 1945. And here we go again. Another chance to get it right, to build a stable world. But the ink is barely dry on the surrender documents when the alliance that won the war just completely fractures. And this time, it creates a totally new kind of conflict. Not a hot war with massive battles, but a Cold War. A war fought with spies, with propaganda, with smaller proxy wars, and all under the constant, terrifying shadow of the atomic bomb. And this picture from the Yalta Conference says it all, really. You have the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, all sitting there, planning the end of the war and what comes next. But even as they're smiling for the cameras, these massive ideological cracks between the West and the Soviet Union are already starting to show. The stage for the next big conflict was being set right here. And this really gets to the heart of why the Cold War was so cold and so long. It wasn't just about two countries wanting more land or resources. It was a fight between two completely opposite ideas about how the world should work. You had capitalism and liberal democracy on one side, and communism on the other. Free markets versus central planning. Individual rights versus the power of the state. This deep, ideological divide is what defined the entire era. So, the million-dollar question: who started it? And surprise, surprise, historians still don't agree. The traditional Western view says it was all Stalin's fault, that the USSR was just bent on spreading communism and the West had to contain it. But then you have the revisionist view, which argues that actually the US was the aggressive one, using its new atomic bomb and its economic muscle to try and run the world, which forced a defensive Soviet Union to react. The real answer? It's probably somewhere in the middle. A really complicated mess of fear, mistrust, and misunderstanding on both sides. And if you really want to try and understand the Soviet point of view, you have to look at this number. Just look at it. Over 20 million Soviet people died in World War II. 20 million. That kind of national trauma, it changes a country. It's really the key to understanding why Stalin was so obsessed with creating this buffer of friendly countries in Eastern Europe. From his perspective, it was a totally defensive move to make sure they were never invaded again. But from the West's perspective, it looked like pure, aggressive communist expansion. So for the next 4 decades, more than 40 years, the entire world basically just held its breath. The Cold War was the story. It dominated everything. And then, with a speed that just shocked everyone, the whole thing just collapsed. I mean, it happened so fast, it was breathtaking. It starts with strikes in Poland, then pretty soon you have free elections there, and then the Berlin Wall comes down. It was this perfect storm, really. The Soviet economy was a wreck, you had massive popular protests demanding change, and you had a new kind of Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was actually willing to listen and reform. And all of that together led to this sudden and thankfully mostly peaceful end to the biggest conflict of the 20th century. And right here, we see that cycle we talked about at the very beginning. The end of the Cold War solves the huge problem of the post-World War II era, right? This threat of nuclear war between two superpowers is suddenly gone. But just like before, solving that one massive problem leaves the world with a whole new set of questions and a totally uncertain future. And that really brings us full circle. That cycle of problem, then a solution, which then creates a new problem, it just keeps going. The Cold War is over, great, but its end unleashed all sorts of new challenges. You've got nationalism flaring up all over the old Soviet bloc, new conflicts igniting in other parts of the world, and this brand new question: what does the world look like? And what's the role of the US when there's only one superpower left? It just goes to show you, the story of history is never, ever really over.